Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
It's that time of year when readers get a chance to indulge in the latest edition of Delmarva Review. You're listening to Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. This is the 15th volume of the evocative prose and poetry with some 60 authors. It's established in 2008 and has had some 490 authors from across the nation as well as 16 other countries. In our studio this morning are the founder and executive editor, Wilson Wyatt, and poetry editor, Ann Colwell. And also by phone, Catherine Gecker, assistant poetry editor. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So I want to turn to you, Wilson, first, and give me an overall impression of the kinds of works that you saw, and how do they compare, say, for instance, to years past?
Well, we had 60 authors this year, and that we accepted out of about 4,500 submissions, which is amazing. When we first started, you were talking about a couple of hundred, perhaps. So but it's interesting when we go back and we look at all of the editions, all 15 editions of the review, I'd have to say that there's not one piece that I regret that we didn't publish. The quality has been amazing, and you mentioned that we have published 490 authors over these 15 years, and the 60 pieces that the 60 authors that we published in this edition are excellent, but they all have been. It's been a remarkable journey so far, and I have to say that one of the reasons for it is that the editors, the poetry editors, the fiction editors, the nonfiction editor, are looking for quality work, and the competition has become much more than we ever dreamed. But we still have published 46% of all the authors we've published are from the Chesapeake Delmarva region, which is outstanding.
Has it changed over the period of time in terms of not so much quality as it is composition or interest or subject matter?
Not really. Grief, loss, death, love. These are all themes that just keep repeating and repeating. So I would say that grief and loss are the two big ones that you just can't get away from, and certainly some of the ones that we'll talk about today relate to that.
Now, what if I turn to one of the stories, Butchery? Tell me a little bit about, obviously, the author who's featured, as well as the story. What struck you? And I understand that there was some discussion about this story, but what drove you to, and what do you think you got out of it?
Butchery is an interesting short story. First of all, it is very well written by Josh Trapani, and he's a scientist and a writer, and he also does book reviews in Washington, D.C. He's from the Eastern Shore. What is amazing to me is the character development in this piece. They're so real. I really feel like the author knows his characters, and he knows science as well. So you get a feel when you start reading it. It is so well crafted that it's very natural. And the interesting there are three basic characters: a scientist named Saunderson, a young student professor named Kate, and a guide that takes them through Ethiopia named Berhanyu. And the interesting thing to me is the play on the word butchery. There's a scene early on when they are in a village in Ethiopia, and Kate witnesses a goat being butchered, and she's taken back by it. At first, it doesn't bother her, but then all of a sudden, they have trouble killing the goat, and it really gets to her. And it is a butchery. It's a professional butchery in this village. But later, they're going through the Ethiopia highlands, and very rough terrain. They're on their own, and suddenly there is a thud, and the professor, who is hardened and wants to get to the location where they have a discovery, is saying, I want to get there, and he floors it and keeps going. Meanwhile, they see in the background, they see all these natives with torches coming after them, and this wailing, just like the wailing that Kate had when she saw the goat killed. It turns out that they had run over someone, and the professor knew it and decided it was too important to get to his destination and wanted to go on. And in the end, Kate leaves in the middle of Ethiopia, leaves the truck, abandons it, and because she made a choice, and she had her values, and those values existed to the very end. It's a beautiful story. The one thing I thought was really struck home to me was that the author knew his subject so well that you didn't ever question it as you read it. He knew the detail. I kept looking up words that I didn't know because they were Ethiopian words, and it was just so well done. So when we get a story like that, which is pretty rare, it's outstanding. If you go back to something that Hemingway said many years ago, writing true, and he kept repeating those words throughout his novels to the point where you got a little tired of Hemingway saying, we want to write true, but you really felt it in this piece.
The other piece, by the way, is Goodbye, Mr. Kamala, which seems to take sort of maybe slightly the opposite tack in terms of the decisions or the choices that we make in life. Yes.
The Goodbye, Mr. Kamali is a piece that is written by a young Iranian woman who lives now in the Washington, D.C. area. And it starts off with a student who is with a young girl in Iran who is living in a small village, and her mother at 9 years old, her mother tells her as a 9-year-old to get into a cupboard because the religious far right folks are coming after her father and Mr. Kamali, who is one of her father's best friends. And that one is much more structured toward revealing what's going on in Iran, what went on then and what's going on today. And that's what the author is trying to get across.
I mean, it seems as if in many ways it's a story about intolerance, which leads people to do certain things or give up certain choices they might make.
That's exactly right. And it's the theology that is so that has taken over that country, and the intolerance of the leaders to allow you to exist without paying homage to the religion is really, I think she does a very good job in nailing that and in showing the fear that a young girl particularly is going to have as she realizes for the first time that death and intolerance are or something that she has to fear.
Indeed, I'm reminded actually of some recent news in which women in Afghanistan have basically said their lives have been sort of shut off because of the decision by the Afghan authorities, the Taliban, to keep them from going to school. Sort of hits home, I think, at this moment. The other story, by the way, that I was interested in, nonfiction, was A Full Moon on the Water by John Philip Drury. Tell me a little bit about him and the story.
John Philip Drury actually grew up on the Eastern Shore, and then he's now he now teaches at university. Well, he's in Cincinnati. He's taught at the University of Cincinnati, and he wrote a piece in this story takes place. It's a nonfiction, and we feature an interview with him in this review. It takes place in 1958, and which is interesting because it's a story about his mother, and he discovered that his mother's closest female friend she was in a love affair with her mother, and it eventually led to a divorce with the father. But that triangle of those three people, that's what this story, or this nonfiction story, is all about. Again, 1958, a long time before before this kind of relationship could be tolerated, let alone, in public view. And that's what John Drury is trying to accomplish in this piece.
The other piece, by the way, I noticed was, I think, Do I Grieve, Do I Mourn? Which spins a bit off of COVID, but I guess the question is whether or not, we see people who are passing from us because of death, whether we should be celebrating or whether we should be weeping.
That is a nonfiction piece by Sally Bingham, who's a highly regarded author, and her family has had a lot of grief, has suffered a lot of grief. And if anyone can write about it, she can. And basically, she shows in this piece where it's one thing to feel grief, it's another thing to mourn. And she really does a very cutting job, I think, in separating the two and playing and talking about how easy it is to go to a memorial service, for example, far, far away from the actual death, and where everyone is having cocktails and goodies, and she said, let the party begin. Whereas the real grief that's felt and the tears should remain private.
And I want to turn to you. You're the poetry editor. Just overall, first of all, how would you characterize the kind of poems that you saw and you published this issue?
I think Catherine would probably agree too that we saw everything. I can't. I mean, we read lots and lots and lots of poems and every different kind of poem that you can imagine. So formal, open form, language poetry. Just everything that you can imagine.
And anything particularly overall that struck you that tied these things together, or
that tied together the poems we chose? Mm-hmm. You mean? No, we don't really start with a theme or any preconceived idea about what we want. And what we try to do is to always just choose the very best poems that we can that get submitted to us, which is, actually, very best poems is somewhat subjective, right? So we're reading and saying which are the best to us and why. And so I think one of the things that I love so much about being the poetry editor is that I get a chance to have these conversations with Wilson and with Catherine, about what's happening in which poems, what makes a poem better than another poem, what are the voices that we're hearing. And that's the fun of this to me, is really the conversations that we have and how we get down to what we think are the very best poems. And sometimes poems just knock you over. They're just, you read them and you're like, oh, yes, Yes, a million times yes. But a lot of times you have to fight your way toward if this poem is working, what's working in it, and then is this thing that's working in this poem as good as these other things that are working over here? So
I want to turn to Catherine Carter. She's the feature poet. Tell me a little bit about her, and obviously there's one of the poems by the way, that struck me was "Reasons to Burn Her" about Serena Williams. Tell me first of all a little bit about Carter, and then perhaps we can read the poem.
Catherine Carter grew up on the Eastern Shore, and she and I have been friends since graduate school, so that's a long time. And I've known her work forever, and I adore her work and her. But one of the things that I love very much about her work is the bravery of her work. And she writes, her parents are scientists, and her dad is a scientist and her mom is a teacher. And in the interview with me, she says this wonderful thing where she says, I probably don't build on a floodplain was not my first sentence, but it could have been. And that's very much, she comes at nature and the world from this perspective that is both highly scientific but also really deeply spiritual, and looking at the connection of all life. But also she comes at it thinking about bodies. And so a lot of her poems are about bodies and what it is to inhabit a body, and since she's a woman, what it is to inhabit a woman's body. And so I think one of the things that I love about Reasons to Burn Her is that it's a poem that is resilient and joyful and strong, and it's about Serena Williams, and it takes on race and it takes on gender in ways that lots of other people don't.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is called Reasons to Burn Her, and it has an epigraph that is from Bernard Guidicelli of Serena Williams. This is Bernard Guidicelli talking about Serena Williams' black catsuit in the 2018 French Open, and he says, "I think that sometimes we've gone too far. It will no longer be accepted. One must respect the game and the place." 1. She won't always wear white. 2. She braided bright beads in her hair instead of embracing the burning comb and formaldehyde, breathing its blight. 3. She looked too good in what she wore. Trashy, like a whore. And we should know. We grow whores to do what we need and then flog them for our needing it. We know from whores. 4. In what she wore, she looked too much like a hero. If she were a hero, it would mean we had been wrong about what heroes were. 5. She chose her own health over our hiss and roar. She ought to be willing to die, to respect how we think she should look. And if how we think she should look bounces somewhere new with every stroke, so what? She should still try to please us so we can tell her she's failed. Fault. Love. We know the score. 6. She played her game with more power than she should. That can't be right. A woman that powerful must be a panther, a Medusa, a siren, a witch, unclean, at the very least inappropriate. Too much fire. Too far. 7. We look upon glory and we look on ourselves, and we have to destroy the glory, defile the holy, dethrone the queen. 8. How dare she walk away from us, shrugging, going on, declining to be destroyed, serene.
So I understand that there was some discussion about this poem. Wilson?
When we were looking at all of Catherine's poems, we wanted to accept all of them, and we got to that one, and it really hit me very hard because I think so much of Serena Williams. I mean, I'm just amazed by that woman and what she has accomplished and how she keeps going. And she does it with a smile on her face, facing all of these obstacles, all of these racial obstacles and obstacles as a woman in a sport where she can outpower most men. I mean, it's so I resisted that poem. And I think when Anne and Catherine and I talked about it, I think we all agreed, well, maybe we won't do this one. But then it's like in so much poetry, you read it again, and then you read it again, and it just keeps coming. And it's magnificent.
Catherine, what did you think about the discussion that you all had in terms of A, whether to put this poem in, and B, the reaction to it?
I think it's important to acknowledge that we are three white people reacting to a poem written by a white woman about a black woman's challenges in life. And that was my hesitation about taking the poem. Are we taking up more space than we should? I can't help thinking of Claudia Rankine's wonderful in Citizen about Serena Williams. But I want to just acknowledge the craft and the power of this poem. It goes beyond race. It goes into how women have been both traumatized, criticized, judged throughout history. She uses words like Medusa, siren, witch. The way Catherine Carter plays on the sounds, so many of the sounds echo the sounds in the word whore, holy, war, wrong. These are slant rhymes. These are just incredibly powerful uses of language, and it speaks to the best of poetry. So I put aside any hesitation I had, but I was one of those who hesitated about accepting it because the poem is so fine, and it deserves a place in the world.
Let me ask you this, because we all are here, we all are white. Do you think that our reaction will be different, say, to this poem as opposed to somebody who's African American, or did you discuss, for that matter, this story, this poem with anyone who's African American? Anybody?
We didn't discuss it with anyone who was African American. The issue was just there in front of us, and but it was interesting. I think we all shared a little bit of concern, but then also the power of the poem just came right through.
Well, and I think part of what we were going back and forth between is, is it okay? Yeah. Is it okay to speak from the perspective of somebody and imagine yourself into that perspective? And, especially in this particular moment, this is really a moment where we've become aware of appropriation and co-opting. And yet at the same time, if you can't imagine yourself into another human being's perspective, you can't write anything, right? You can't write fiction, you can't write poetry, you're done. You're, just shut up. So we sort of, and that was a tension. But I want to say again, I really think it was a wonderful tension to have and to sit with, and so I'm sure that there are people out here who will think we made the wrong decision, and I respect that.
Well, one of the things that struck me is that the poem really isn't written from the point of view of someone who's African American. The poem is really the observations themselves are actually coming from somebody who's white.
Yes.
And I think that's something that I think, as opposed to trying to view the world through somebody else's eyes.
That's a good point. Yeah, the criticism, the poem is from the point of view of the people who actually, like the epigram, epigraph, I should say, are leveling criticism.
Right. The other poem, by the way, Catherine, is Father's Nightmare. Tell me a little bit about who wrote it and what attracted you to this poem.
This is by Henry Stimson, and Mr. Stimson is from Massachusetts. He's widely published. He wrote in his bio that he hopes to see another Celtics championship sooner or later, which I found just charming. This poem is Father's Nightmare, and there are a few things about it. It's 12 lines. They're written in 3-line stanzas. It is spare, and yet what it's talking about is horrific. He also doesn't use a single period in the poem, and it's not as if the line breaks exactly mimic where a period would normally appear. Wouldn't you say that's true, Anne?
Absolutely.
Yes. So it's going to be a challenge to read, and I'd like to just plunge right into it and let the poem speak for itself.
Go ahead.
Father's Nightmare. The dream says she's my daughter, and I believe it, though she's changed. Under her bed is a shoebox with a rubber hose and clamps, a gas canister for cooking heroin, a needle thick as a nail. Looking scared and stubborn, she says, I'm not an addict. Her skin is dry, brown pitted with holes like bug bites.
What do you think that anguish expresses in the disappointment that many, for instance, parents may have of a child, oftentimes who, whether it's drugs or it's some other terrible thing that happens to them, I mean, it's almost as if it's a bit of a surprise, I think, in some ways. I get the feeling anyway from this poem.
One of the things I think Henry Stimson does so beautifully is he doesn't say, and I felt agony about this, and I was so upset. He's describing something, and by describing it while leaving himself out, it makes the poem so powerful. You can feel this anguish that a father would have. And he lets the title do a lot of work, Father's Nightmare. That's all you need to know. And I think that's why the poem works so well. It's disciplined, it's restrained, and yet the story is horrific.
I mean, it almost seems as if when you read it, or if you were to hear it, that you, as a person who is either hearing it or reading it, that they're filling in that bit which you say he's left out.
I think so. And you're always so eloquent about poetry. Perhaps you could speak to it as well.
Well, and actually it makes me think about the thing that we were talking about right before we started taping, which is what you said about, the not trying to say everything, not trying to close. One of the things I love about this poem is it's so open. It doesn't say anything that is judgmental or closed down in any way. It just says, this is my dream. Let me describe it to you. And then it ends.
Yeah.
And finally, Wilson, I want to turn to you because you have a student who wrote piece, not poetry, Maxine Poe Jensen. Tell me then a little bit about what you wrote and also this process of editing, which we were talking about.
Yes, this year we decided to we have a partnership with the Talbot County schools and with one of our sponsors, which is the Talbot County Arts Council, and we started a mentorship scholarship program, selecting one student in high school to continue on as a senior in high school, and that the winner this year was Maxine Poe Jensen. And the concept here is that a student who really enjoys writing and wants the opportunity to have the opportunity to be published in a major literary journal is quite significant coming in high school, number one. And so the mentorship is that Maxine Poe Jensen was able to work with our managing editor, Bill Gorgie, to work on her piece so that she could see what the whole process was to publish a piece, which she did. She also got a small stipend to encourage her ongoing writing. So it's the first time we've done it. We're going to do it again this year, and it's the piece that she wrote is quite powerful. It really is. How do you deal with being a walking reminder of loss? The piece is E Duo Unum, and the concept here is of twin brothers, and one of them dies, and how does the other one maintain this deal with loss for the rest of his life?
Well, we've been speaking with Wilson Wyatt. He is the founder and editor of the Delmarva Review, also poetry editor Ann Colwell, and by phone, Catherine Gecker, the assistant poetry editor. Appreciate you all taking the time to talk with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.